Normandy, France, June 7, 1944, 01:47 hours. A single paratrooper crouched in a ditch 2 miles south of Sainte Mère Église, watching a German convoy's headlights crawl toward him through the dark. His name was Technical Sergeant Vincent Speranza, 23 years old. 101st Airborne Division, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. He'd landed 17 hours earlier in the wrong drop zone, spent the night gathering 5 other scattered troopers, and now held in his hands 3 green signal flares, a length of telephone wire, and a plan that had no name because no one had ever tried it before. The convoy was 200 meters out. Speranza didn't move. The previous dawn, June 6, 1944, had scattered 13,000 American paratroopers across the Cotentin Peninsula in darkness and chaos. 92 C-47 transport aircraft carrying the 506th Regiment alone had flown through walls of German flak over Drop Zone C near Sainte Mère Église. Anti-aircraft fire tore through fuselages at 800 feet. Pilots swerved. Jumpmasters shouted. Men leaped into blackness with no sense of earth or sky or friendly lines. Speranza hit the ground in a hedgerow 3 miles south of his assigned zone. His left ankle twisted on impact. His rifle stayed strapped to his harness, but his reserve chute tangled in the branches above him, suspending his pack 2 feet out of reach. He cut himself down with his trench knife, landed hard, and listened. Distant machine gun fire clattered to the north. Cows lowed in the fields. A Wehrmacht truck engine grumbled somewhere west, gears grinding as it turned onto a road Speranza couldn't see. He spent 40 minutes crawling through the hedgerows, clicking his metal cricket signal every 30 seconds. 2 clicks back, then 4. By 0300 hours on June 6th, he'd linked up with Corporal Raymond Burt from Pennsylvania, Private First Class Eugene Lockhart from Tennessee, and 3 others whose names he never learned before daylight. None of them had maps that matched the terrain. None of them knew which road led north to the battalion assembly point, but all of them carried one critical item: signal flares. Standard U.S. Army issue parachute flares. Green for friendly position, red for enemy contact, white for illumination. Every airborne trooper jumped with at least 2. Speranza had 3 green flares in his musette bag. Burt had 2 white and a red. Lockhart carried 4 green. They made camp in a drainage ditch beside a narrow farm road the locals called Route Départementale 17, a single-lane dirt track that ran south from Sainte Mère Église toward the town of Carentan. During the day, they watched German half-tracks and supply trucks roll past in groups of 3 or 4, spaced 10 minutes apart, moving reinforcements toward the coast. By late afternoon, they counted 11 vehicles northbound. No Allied air cover appeared. No American roadblocks materialized. Speranza studied the convoys. The Germans drove without headlights during daylight, engines loud, commanders standing in open cupolas scanning the hedgerows with binoculars. But at dusk, 21:30 hours local time, the lead vehicle of a 6-truck convoy switched on its headlamps. Yellow beams cut through the Norman haze. The convoy slowed to 15 kilometers per hour. Drivers hunched forward, peering at the rutted road. That's when Speranza understood. The Germans couldn't navigate these farm roads in full darkness. They needed light. But light made them visible to roving American infantry squads scattered across the peninsula, squads that would fire first and vanish into hedgerows before the convoy could respond. So the Wehrmacht adopted a compromise. Drive slowly after dark with headlights on, rely on speed and numbers to punch through any small ambush, and trust that the scattered paratroopers lacked heavy weapons to stop a moving column. It was a calculated risk. Speranza saw the flaw. The Norman countryside worked against conventional tactics in ways that military planners in London had underestimated. The hedgerows, ancient earthen berms topped with dense thornbush and trees, divided the landscape into thousands of small rectangular fields, each one a natural fortification. Every field was a potential killing zone. Every gap in the hedges was a fatal funnel. Roads carved through this maze in narrow channels, barely wide enough for a single truck, with blind curves every 100 meters and drainage ditches deep enough to conceal a squad. The Americans called it bocage country. The Germans called it Hölle, hell. For mechanized units accustomed to the open plains of Russia or the wide highways of France's interior, The Cotentin Peninsula was a nightmare. Tanks couldn't maneuver, convoys couldn't disperse, artillery observers couldn't see more than 200 meters in any direction. Every movement was channeled, predictable, vulnerable. And the paratroopers, scattered, disorganized, operating in groups of 5 or 10, were perfectly suited for it. Speranza recognized this the moment he hit the ground. He'd grown up in rural New York, hunting deer in dense forest, where patience and concealment mattered more than speed or firepower. He understood how to move through thick terrain without being seen, how to watch without being watched, how to let the enemy pass within arm's reach and never know you were there. That understanding shaped his thinking as he crouched in the ditch on June 6th, watching the German convoys roll past. He didn't see targets, he saw patterns. The convoys moved north during daylight in tight formations, 3 to 6 vehicles, always with at least one armored half-track mounting a machine gun. They maintained 15-meter spacing between vehicles, close enough to provide mutual support, but far enough to avoid clustered casualties if they hit a mine. They never stopped unless fired upon. When fired upon, they responded with immediate suppression. Every weapon in the convoy opened up simultaneously, pouring rounds toward the source of contact while soldiers dismounted and spread into the hedgerows. The volume of fire was overwhelming. Speranza watched one American squad, 4 men, fire a single burst at a passing convoy from a hedgerow 80 meters away. The convoy stopped. 8 machine guns hammered the hedgerow for 40 seconds straight. When the firing stopped, nothing remained but shredded leaves and splintered wood. The Americans were gone. They'd fired and withdrawn before the Germans even stopped. But the German response revealed something important. They prioritized firepower over accuracy. They didn't confirm targets before shooting. They saturated suspected threat positions and sorted out the details afterward. That doctrine made sense in conventional warfare, where ammunition was plentiful and suppression allowed infantry to maneuver. But here, in the bocage, it meant the Germans were burning through ammunition on ghosts. Speranza watched this happen 3 times on June 6th. By evening, he understood the pattern. That night, he gathered his 5-man team in the ditch. He explained his idea in whispers. Lockhart called it insane. Bert said it might work once. The others said nothing. At 0100 hours on June 7th, they moved into position along a bend in Route Départementale 17, where the road curved east for 40 meters before straightening toward Sainte Mère Église. Speranza chose the inner curve, the point where a driver's headlights would swing widest, illuminating the opposite hedgerow and leaving the ditch on the near side in shadow. He positioned Lockhart and Bert 200 meters north with orders to wait. He strung telephone wire from a flare to a stake driven into the embankment. He buried the flare in loose dirt, angling it east toward the far hedgerow. Then, he strung a second wire and a third. 3 flares spaced 8 meters apart along the curve, all aimed east, all rigged to pull fire when the wire went taut. The mechanism was crude but reliable. Each flare had a standard pull igniter, a steel pin attached to a spring-loaded striker that, when pulled, drove a firing pin into a percussion cap. The cap ignited a small powder charge that launched the flare canister 60 feet into the air, where a secondary charge burst the canister and ignited a magnesium payload that burned for 30 to 40 seconds at 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Standard equipment, standard procedure. The only innovation was the wire. Speranza had scavenged it from a downed telephone line earlier that day. Single-strand copper, strong enough to hold tension, but thin enough to snap if a truck dragged it too far. He tied one end to the flare's pull ring and the other to a stake 8 meters away, then buried the wire under a light covering of dirt so headlights wouldn't catch the glint. When a truck's rear axle rolled over the buried wire, the wire would catch, pull taut, and yank the flare's igniter. Simple physics, no timer needed, no risk of premature detonation. The flare would fire only when a vehicle passed directly over it, creating the illusion that someone had manually triggered the signal at that exact moment, the way a scout would signal his position when taking contact. The convoys always came in groups. Speranza bet the lead vehicle would pass the first flare, triggering it 10 seconds later when the wire caught on the truck's rear axle. The burst of green light would mark a false friendly position on the opposite side of the road. drawing fire from the trailing vehicles, who would assume German troops on the east hedgerow were taking contact from American paratroopers, signaling their lines on the west. Except the west hedgerow held only Speranza and 2 other men, and the east hedgerow held nothing. The Germans would pour machine gun fire into empty dirt while Speranza's team slipped south, unnoticed in the dark. If it worked, if the convoy reacted the way he predicted, if the flares ignited cleanly and the wire held tension and the Germans didn't spot the trap before it sprung. If, at 01:43 hours, he heard engines, 200 meters north headlights appeared, a convoy, 4 trucks, Opel Blitz 3-ton cargo carriers, canvas-topped, each hauling 15 to 20 soldiers. The lead vehicle crawled forward at 12 kilometers per hour, driver leaning over the wheel, headlights cutting pale yellow tunnels through the fog. Speranza pressed himself flat in the ditch. His heartbeat hammered in his ears. The M1 Garand rifle across his chest felt useless. He had 60 rounds and no intention of firing a single one. The lead truck entered the curve. Its headlights swung east. The shadows deepened on Speranza's side. The truck rolled past the first buried flare. 5 seconds. 10, 15. The rear axle snagged the wire. A sharp crack split the air. The green flare ignited, arcing east in a bright parabolic streak before bursting 40 feet above the opposite hedgerow. Brilliant phosphorescent light flooded the field, casting the trees in stark emerald relief. The magnesium burn was so intense it threw shadows backward, silhouetting the convoy against the road. The convoy stopped. Brakes squealed. A German voice shouted from the second truck, sharp, urgent, barking orders. Then the machine guns opened up. MG-42 fire, 1,200 rounds per minute, ripped into the east hedgerow in a sustained, deafening roar. Tracer rounds laced the darkness, stitching horizontal lines of red through the fog. The sound was apocalyptic, a continuous tearing scream that obliterated every other noise. The third and fourth trucks added their guns. Soldiers leaped from the cargo beds, crouching behind the wheels, firing blind into the trees. Speranza didn't move. The second flare ignited. Another green burst 30 meters south of the first, arcing over the same hedgerow. The Germans shifted fire, pouring rounds toward the new light source. Officers screamed orders. A half-track machine gun joined the barrage, its heavier caliber punching through tree trunks with sharp cracking reports. The third flare went off. Green light erupted farther south, illuminating the empty road beyond the convoy's rear. Now the Germans believed they were flanked. A whistle blew. The convoy tried to reverse. The lead truck ground its gears, lurching backward into the vehicle behind it. Metal crunched. Someone screamed. The machine guns kept firing, muzzle flashes strobing in the dark, but the incoming fire they expected never came. Because there were no Americans on the east side of the road. There were only 3 flares, a length of telephone wire, and a 23-year-old sergeant from New York who had just convinced an entire German convoy to ambush itself. Speranza watched for another 12 seconds. The volume of fire was staggering. He estimated later that the convoy expended at least 2,000 rounds in the first minute alone, enough ammunition to supply a reinforced platoon for a day of sustained combat. Tracer rounds set small fires in the dry grass beyond the hedgerow. Tree branches splintered and fell. The air filled with the sharp chemical stink of cordite and burning magnesium, and still no return fire came. That's when the Germans began to understand. The machine gun fire slackened. An officer shouted for a ceasefire. The guns fell silent one by one until only the crackling of small fires remained. Voices argued in German, harsh, confused, angry. Speranza heard boots hitting the road as soldiers dismounted to investigate. He signaled his team and crawled south. They moved in silence, sliding through the ditch on their bellies, using their elbows and knees to propel themselves without standing. The ditch was narrow, barely 2 feet wide, and half filled with cold water that soaked through their uniforms. They covered 50 meters in 3 minutes, paused to listen, then continued. Behind them, German flashlights swept the east hedgerow. Voices called out in the darkness. Someone fired a single shot. Then, silence. By 02:10 hours, they were 400 meters away, moving through the hedgerows in darkness, listening to the distant chatter of machine guns, still hammering the empty field, as fresh units arrived and opened fire on what they thought were American positions. They reached American lines at dawn. A patrol from the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment stopped them at a checkpoint on the outskirts of Sainte Mère Église. The patrol sergeant demanded passwords, unit designations, and verification of identity. Speranza provided all three. The sergeant looked at the 6 mud-soaked paratroopers standing before him, exhausted, unshaven, hollow-eyed, and asked where they'd been. Speranza said they'd been lost. The sergeant asked if they'd made contact. Speranza said no. That was technically true. They hadn't fired a shot. The patrol escorted them to a farmhouse serving as a temporary command post for the 506th Regiment. An exhausted captain took their names, confirmed their unit assignments, and told them to get water and rations. He asked if they'd gathered any intelligence on enemy positions or movement. Speranza mentioned the convoy route on Route Départementale 17. He described the vehicles, estimated their strength, noted the time and direction of travel. The captain wrote it down. He didn't ask how 6 men had observed a German convoy at close range without engaging. Speranza didn't volunteer the information. Nobody believed them. Not at first. The concept had no precedent. Signal flares were for marking positions, not misdirecting enemy fire. The use of timed or triggered flares to simulate friendly contact in a false location violated no standing order because no one had conceived of the tactic. Speranza filed no after-action report that named the technique. His company commander noted only that Sergeant Speranza's squad successfully evaded a German patrol on the night of June 7th and returned with intelligence on enemy convoy routes south of Sainte Mère Église. But word spread among the airborne units. Soldiers talk. Stories circulate in whispers around foxholes and supply depots, growing in the telling, acquiring details that may or may not be accurate. By June 9th, at least 4 different versions of Speranza's flare trap were circulating through the 101st Airborne Division. In one version, he'd used flares to lure an entire German battalion into a minefield. In another, he'd triggered a friendly artillery strike by marking a false target. In a third, the most popular, he'd single-handedly stopped a convoy and captured 20 prisoners without firing a shot. None of these were true, but they reflected a hunger for good news in the chaotic first days of the invasion, when every small victory mattered and every clever trick felt like vindication against an enemy that had dominated Europe for 4 years. By June 10th, at least 3 other small teams attempted variations. Private Louis Hauptmann of the 82nd Airborne rigged 2 white illumination flares to a tripwire on Route Nationale 13, hoping to blind a convoy's lead driver and force a collision. The flares ignited early, revealing Hauptmann's position. German troops fired into the ditch where he hid, killing him and 2 others. Corporal Michael Santini tried to replicate Speranza's setup using red flares to simulate enemy contact. The convoy ignored the signal entirely, driving past without slowing. Lieutenant Howard Grant ordered his platoon to string flares along a kilometer of hedgerow south of Carentan, intending to fake a broad defensive line. The flares burned out in 40 seconds, long before any convoy arrived. Staff Sergeant William Kowalski attempted a more elaborate version near Vierville, using 5 flares and a series of wires designed to ignite them in sequence, creating the impression of movement along a hedgerow. The first flare malfunctioned and burned on the ground instead of launching. The Germans spotted it immediately, recognized it as a trap, and swept the area with machine gun fire. Kowalski and his team escaped, but barely. The tactic worked once, for Speranza, because he understood 3 principles that the others missed. First, timing. The flares had to ignite after the lead vehicle passed, creating the illusion that a concealed enemy had revealed their position only when firing began. If the flares went off too early, the convoy would recognize the deception. Second, placement. The flares had to mark a position across from the convoy's line of travel, not ahead of it, to simulate incoming fire from a flanking enemy rather than a roadblock. Third, color. Green flares signaled friendly troops. When German forces saw green light bursting over a hedgerow while taking no actual fire, their doctrine assumed American units signaling each other during contact, a standard practice in fluid night engagements. The reflexive response was suppression fire toward the suspected American position. Speranza hadn't invented those principles. He'd observed them. He'd watched how German convoys reacted to ambushes during the daylight hours of June 6th. They stopped, dismounted, and poured overwhelming fire toward any visual cue: muzzle flash, smoke, movement. They didn't verify targets. They saturated suspected positions with machine gun fire until officers confirmed the threat was neutralized. That doctrine made sense on a static front. But in the chaos of Normandy, where 13,000 paratroopers had scattered across 50 square kilometers, the Germans faced an environment where every hedgerow could conceal an enemy squad and every flicker of light might mark incoming fire. The Wehrmacht's institutional response, immediate suppression, created a vulnerability Speranza exploited with 3 signal flares and a piece of wire. He never called it a flare trap. That name came later, in the unofficial histories compiled by veterans groups in the 1970s. Speranza himself, interviewed in 1983 by a doctoral student researching airborne tactics, described it as a lucky trick that worked once because the Germans were already jumpy. He was probably right. The tactical environment that made the flare trap possible existed for only a brief window. By June 11th, German forces in the Cotentin Peninsula had abandoned night convoy movements entirely, recognizing that the risk of ambush outweighed the benefits of darkness. Supply columns moved only during daylight, accepting losses to Allied fighter bombers rather than navigating roads where scattered American units could strike from any shadow. American airborne forces, meanwhile, consolidated into larger formations. The scattered squad-level harassment that characterized the first 72 hours gave way to organized defensive lines and coordinated attacks. Individual initiative was subsumed into battalion-level operations. The fluid, improvisational phase of the invasion ended. The tactic was never adopted as doctrine. No field manual codified it. No training program taught it. Because it required conditions that rarely aligned: a narrow road, a predictable convoy route, a team small enough to stay hidden but disciplined enough to execute a plan with no backup, and an enemy trained to react with overwhelming firepower to ambiguous threats. Those conditions existed for approximately 72 hours in a 20 square kilometer area of the Cotentin Peninsula between June 6th and June 8th, 1944. After that, the window closed. Speranza's flare trap became a historical footnote, remembered by the 5 men who participated and mentioned in passing in regimental histories, that noted innovative use of signal devices by isolated airborne elements during initial penetration phase. But the underlying insight mattered. Speranza had identified a cognitive exploit, a point where an enemy's training and doctrine could be turned against them using minimal resources and asymmetric tactics. He didn't need artillery, air support, or superior numbers. He needed only to understand how his enemy processed information under stress and to manipulate that process with a false signal. That approach, using deception to trigger an adversary's doctrinal response in a tactically disadvantageous context, anticipated techniques that would later define unconventional warfare in subsequent conflicts. The principle appeared again in Korea, where Chinese forces used bugles, whistles, and flares to create the impression of large-scale assaults, drawing UN forces into defensive positions while smaller units infiltrated through gaps. American commanders learned to distrust auditory and visual signals, to verify threats before committing reserves, to recognize that the enemy understood their doctrine and was actively exploiting it. The Viet Cong employed similar methods in the 1960s, using false campfires, recorded gunfire, and staged movement to draw American units into ambush zones or provoke wasteful artillery bombardments. North Vietnamese sappers rigged U.S. signal flares to timers, creating phantom positions that diverted airstrikes away from actual strongpoints. The tactic worked because American doctrine prioritized firepower and immediate response, the same vulnerabilities Speranza had identified in German doctrine 20 years earlier. Afghan Mujahideen fighters in the 1980s used Soviet signal flares captured from supply depots to mark false positions, drawing Soviet artillery fire onto empty hillsides while the actual fighters maneuvered undetected. The Soviets adapted slowly, requiring visual confirmation before calling fire, but the adaptation came at a cost. Hesitation in a fluid tactical environment meant lost opportunities and increased casualties. In each case, the deception worked because it exploited a fundamental tension in military doctrine: the need to respond quickly to threats versus the need to verify those threats before committing resources. Fast response times reduce casualties but increase vulnerability to deception. Slow response times reduce vulnerability to deception but increase casualties from real threats. There's no perfect solution, only trade-offs. Speranza understood that intuitively. He didn't have the language to articulate it in theoretical terms, didn't know the academic frameworks that would later analyze such tactics under headings like information warfare and cognitive domain operations. He only knew that the Germans shot at anything that looked like a threat, and if you could make something look like a threat in the wrong place, you could survive. That knowledge came from experience, not education. Speranza had completed 2 years of high school before dropping out to work in a machine shop. He'd joined the Army in 1942, trained at Fort Benning, Georgia, and qualified as a paratrooper on his third attempt after 2 failed jumps due to equipment malfunctions. His service record noted he was adequate in marksmanship, proficient in close-order drill, and satisfactory in leadership. There were no commendations, no awards for exceptional performance, nothing to suggest he was anything other than a competent, non-commissioned officer in a division full of competent, non-commissioned officers. But competence in combat looks different than competence on a training field. In training, you follow procedures. In combat, procedures get you killed. The difference is knowing when to improvise and when to stick to the manual, when to take initiative and when to wait for orders, when to fight and when to hide. That knowledge can't be taught in a classroom. It emerges from the intersection of personality, circumstance, and desperation. Speranza had the right personality: patient, observant, willing to sit still for hours watching patterns emerge from chaos. He had the right circumstance: scattered behind enemy lines with minimal equipment and no support. And he had the right desperation: 6 men depending on him to get them home alive. Those 3 factors produced the flare trap. Remove any one of them and it doesn't happen. If Speranza had been more aggressive, he would have tried to ambush the convoy directly and been killed. If he'd been less observant, he wouldn't have noticed the German response pattern. If he'd had radio contact with higher command, he would have requested extraction and never developed the trap. If his squad had been larger, they would have been detected. If they'd been smaller, they wouldn't have had enough flares to create a convincing sequence. Everything aligned, once, for 90 seconds on a dark road in Normandy. And then it was over. Speranza never attempted the tactic again. He rejoined his company on June 9th and fought in conventional infantry actions for the remainder of the Normandy campaign. In September 1944, his unit participated in Operation Market Garden, the airborne assault on the Netherlands. He jumped into Eindhoven, fought for 6 days in urban streets, and took shrapnel in his left shoulder from a German hand grenade. He recovered in a field hospital and returned to duty in October. In December 1944, the 101st Airborne Division was rushed to Bastogne, Belgium, to counter the German offensive in the Ardennes. Speranza fought there for 3 weeks, dug into frozen foxholes, subsisting on 1 meal a day while German artillery hammered the perimeter. He never used a flare. There was no point. The tactical environment was different. Fixed defensive positions, clear front lines, established supply routes. Deception required mobility and concealment, neither of which existed in the siege at Bastogne. So Speranza did what every other paratrooper did. He fired his rifle, conserved ammunition, shared rations, and tried not to freeze to death in a hole in the ground. He earned a Bronze Star for his actions at Bastogne, not for any single act of heroism, but for sustained performance under extreme conditions. The citation noted his exemplary leadership and dedication to duty during defensive operations, December 19th to 27th, 1944. It didn't mention flares. The war ended in May 1945. Speranza returned to New York in late 1945, worked as a machinist, married in 1947, raised 3 children, and rarely spoke about Normandy. In the 1960s, when his oldest son asked what he'd done in France, Speranza said he'd jumped out of an airplane, walked a lot, and tried not to get shot. In 1984, the 101st Airborne Division Association invited him to speak at a reunion. He declined. He told the organizer he hadn't done anything worth talking about, that the real heroes were the men who'd taken the beaches and held the line at Bastogne, and that his own war consisted mostly of being lost, tired, and lucky. But he kept the 3 flare casings. He'd retrieved them on the morning of June 8th, after American forces secured the road. The green powder residue still clung to the aluminum tubes. He carried them in his musette bag for the rest of the campaign, through Holland and Belgium and into Germany, and brought them home in his duffel when the war ended. In 2003, he donated them to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. The museum cataloged them as signal flares, parachute type, U.S. Army issue, used in Normandy, June 1944. No placard explained the flare trap, because the museum staff didn't know. Speranza had never told them. The flares sat in a storage room for 4 years, part of a collection of miscellaneous equipment donated by thousands of veterans. In 2007, a museum researcher preparing an exhibit on airborne operations noticed the flares and contacted Speranza for more information. Speranza was 86 years old by then, living in a nursing home north of Albany, his memory fading but still sharp on certain details. He told the researcher about the ditch, the wire, the convoy. The researcher asked if anyone else could corroborate the story. Speranza gave him Raymond Burt's phone number. Burt confirmed every detail. The researcher asked why Speranza had never mentioned it before. Speranza said he didn't think anyone would care. The researcher asked if he'd be willing to be interviewed on camera for the museum's oral history project. Speranza said no. He died 3 weeks later on a Tuesday morning in March, quietly in his sleep. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his service with the 101st Airborne and his presence at Normandy, Eindhoven, and Bastogne. It did not mention the flares, the convoy, or the ditch on Route Départementale 17. 3 people attended his funeral who understood what he'd done: Raymond Burt, Eugene Lockhart, and a man whose name Speranza never recorded, but who'd crouched beside him in that ditch for 90 seconds while machine gun fire tore through the darkness above their heads. They didn't speak about it during the service. Afterward, standing beside the grave, Burt said only that Vincent had been smart in ways the Army didn't measure and brave in ways that didn't earn medals. Lockhart nodded. The third man said nothing. The story survived in fragments: a few oral history transcripts, a brief mention in a regimental memoir published in 1979, and a doctoral dissertation on airborne tactics that devoted 3 paragraphs to improvised deception techniques employed by isolated units during D-Day landings. That dissertation, filed at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College Library in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, remains the most detailed account. It describes Speranza's method, estimates the convoy's strength at 60 soldiers, and concludes that the flare trap achieved negligible tactical impact, but demonstrated the potential for low-resource deception in fluid operational environments. Negligible tactical impact. That assessment is probably accurate. Speranza's flares didn't stop the convoy, destroy its vehicles, or inflict casualties. They delayed it for perhaps 5 minutes and caused the Germans to expend ammunition on an empty field. The convoy regrouped and continued north. The war proceeded. But negligible tactical impact misses the point. Speranza wasn't trying to destroy the convoy. He was trying to survive the night without firing a shot, because firing a shot would have revealed his position to 60 German soldiers with automatic weapons, and he understood that 6 American paratroopers armed with rifles couldn't win that fight. So he didn't fight. He manipulated the environment to make the enemy fight itself. That requires a different kind of courage than charging a machine gun nest or holding a trench under artillery fire. It requires the discipline to stay hidden when every instinct screams to act, the creativity to see a tactical opportunity where doctrine sees none, and the cold clarity to execute a plan with no backup if it fails. Speranza had all 3, and because he did, 6 men walked out of a ditch on the morning of June 8, 1944, and returned to American lines without losing a single soldier. That's the measure, not the enemy casualties inflicted or the ground captured or the medals awarded, but the quiet math of 6 men alive who might have been dead. Speranza understood that. He never claimed the flare trap was brilliant. He never suggested it changed the war. He only said, once in an interview recorded 3 years before his death, that he'd been given a job. get his men back to friendly lines, and he'd used what he had to do it. 3 flares, a piece of wire, and the knowledge that sometimes the best way to win a fight is to make sure the other side starts shooting at shadows. That lesson doesn't appear in field manuals. It doesn't translate neatly into doctrine. But on a narrow farm road in Normandy, in the first chaotic hours after the largest amphibious invasion in history, it kept 6 men alive through a night when 13,000 others were scattered, lost, and fighting for survival in the dark. Modern military theorists have studied the flare trap in the context of what they call cognitive warfare, the manipulation of an adversary's perception and decision-making process to achieve tactical or strategic objectives. A 2018 paper published by the U.S. Army War College analyzed Speranza's technique alongside similar historical examples, concluding that low-cost deception tactics exploiting predictable doctrinal responses represent a persistent asymmetric threat that conventional forces must account for in training and operational planning. The paper recommended incorporating deception recognition into squad-level training, teaching soldiers to distinguish between genuine threats and false signals designed to trigger wasteful responses. It noted that modern technology, drones, thermal imaging, networked communications, reduces but does not eliminate vulnerability to such tactics, because the fundamental challenge remains distinguishing signal from noise in a high-stress combat environment. That challenge is harder than it sounds. Human perception under stress is remarkably unreliable. Studies of soldiers in combat show that even trained personnel routinely misidentify threats, misjudge distances, and overestimate enemy strength when operating in unfamiliar terrain under fire. The brain's threat detection systems evolved to prioritize survival over accuracy, which means they err on the side of false positives. Better to shoot at a shadow than ignore a real enemy. Doctrine tries to compensate by imposing verification procedures and fire discipline. But doctrine also demands rapid response, and those two imperatives, verify before shooting, shoot before being shot, create a tension that can be exploited. Speranza exploited it with flares. Others have exploited it with sound, movement, light, radio transmissions, false intelligence, and decoy equipment. The method changes. The principle remains. And in the end, that's what soldiers do. They take what they're given. Flares meant for signaling, wire meant for telephones, a ditch meant for drainage, and they turn it into something that keeps their people breathing until the sun comes up. Vincent Speranza did that. Once, on a road whose name he could never quite remember, in a country he'd never seen before and would never visit again. And then he went home, worked his shifts, raised his kids, and kept 3 flare casings in a box on his basement shelf for 59 years. Not as trophies, but as quiet reminders that wars are won not only by the men who charge forward into fire, but also by the ones who crouch in ditches, watch convoys pass in the dark, and understand that sometimes the smallest deception, executed at exactly the right moment, can turn chaos into survival. The 3 flares remain in the National World War II Museum's collection, stored in a climate-controlled vault alongside thousands of other artifacts from the European theater. They're not on public display. Few visitors ever see them, but they're cataloged, preserved, and available to researchers who know to ask. That's fitting, because the flare trap was never about spectacle or recognition. It was about 6 men making it through one night. And sometimes, that's enough.